Welcome to Revelation Made Simple for another presentation. And tonight we will be studying Revelation chapter 12, and it's our ninth lesson together, ninth presentation. So it's a very important chapter, chapter 12. Before we start the chapter 12, I would like to remind you the threefold structure of Revelation. With chapter 11, we have finished the second section of the book of Revelation. And so now we are entering the last section of the book of Revelation, the third section. So remember, we talked about the prologue in chapter 1, and then the first section was the first century setting, and that finished in chapter 3. Then from chapter 4 to chapter 11, we had the second one, the historical section. And now we are moving into the climax of Earth's history, starting with chapter 12. This will show to us the third section is an eschatological section. It's about the future. Chapter 12, it's an introductory vision to this third section in the book of Revelation. And chapter 12 consists of three different scenes. First, the birth of a child in verses 1 to 6. Second one, the expulsion of Satan from heaven, verses 7 to 12. And then the third section in Revelation 12, it talks about the dragon's persecution of the woman and her offspring. So let's go into chapter 12. As I said, this is an introductory vision to the whole section, Revelation 12 to 22. Okay? That's the eschatological section of the book of Revelation. Let's start reading verses 1 to 6. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with a child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as he was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So here we start in chapter 12 with this verse 1 to 6. That's the first section in chapter 12. Before describing the final battle between Christ and his faithful people and Satan and his followers, John explains the underlying root cause for the hostility that is about to flood God's end-time faithful remnant people. So this is what he is doing here. He is giving some background to us, okay? And so let's see in verse 1. First, John sees a woman. A woman in the Bible is often used as a symbol for God's people, and you have all those verses on the screen. It's the common symbol for God's people. The symbol of a pure and faithful woman consistently stands for God's people that are faithful to him, while a prostitute or a harlot symbolizes the apostate and unfaithful church, and we will see that in Revelation chapter 17. So this woman here in Revelation chapter 12 symbolizes the faithful people of God, the pure church. Now, this woman is clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, this is a very strong allusion to Genesis 37, 9 to 10, where Joseph had a dream with a sun, moon, and 11 stars, and Joseph being the 12th star. And this all represent Jacob, his wife, his sons, and the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel that descended from them. So the brightness of the woman's appearance comes from the light of the glory of the gospel. While she's standing on the Old Testament revelation that reflected the light of the gospel. So the gospel is the Son, because is Jesus Christ, is the good news about Jesus Christ. He is the Son, represented as the Son. So here the Son represents the revelation, the testimony of the New Testament. So this woman receives the light of the Son because it's the gospel. She gets this appearance of light from the gospel, but she's also standing on the moon, and that's the Old Testament testimony, because the Old Testament reflects the light of the gospel, like the moon reflects the light of the sun. The crown with 12 stars signifies the 12 tribes of Israel and also the 12 apostles, because we have the church in the Old Testament symbolically represented by the 12 sons of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, and then in the New Testament it's the symbolic, it's the spiritual Israel, which stands on the foundation of the 12 apostles. So this indicates the continuity between the Old Testament people, the Old Testament church, Israel, and the people of God, the Christian church, the spiritual Israel. So in verse 2, we see that the woman is pregnant with a child and is about to give birth. This is not a literal woman like some suggested. Some people have suggested that this is Mary, the mother of Jesus, about to give birth to Jesus Christ. Once again, this is a symbolic woman representing the people of God, the church. And so if the woman is literal, then everything else has to be literal. The dragon has to be literal, and the sun, moon, and stars should be literal, which would make up for a very weird and confusing imagery. Imagine Mary standing on the literal sun and literal moon, standing on a literal moon and having the literal sun and the 12 stars, and the little dragon is there to attack her. That is a little bit too far-fetched. If it's literal, it's very confusing. So this is all symbolic. The woman of Revelation 12 represents the Old Testament Israel with her 12 tribes, bringing into being the Messiah, because Messiah came from Israel, from the Old Testament church. Just as a woman experiences birth pains in delivering a child, so did Israel experience birth pains in preparing for the coming of the promised offspring, the coming Messiah. Also, the verse says she was tormented, which is the Greek word basanizo. It is normally used with reference to trial and persecution. Tormenting the woman was evidently part of Satan's plan to destroy the covenant people in the Old Testament, Israel, and prevent the birth of the offspring of the woman. And that battle started right from the beginning in Genesis 3 verse 15, where the battle between the offspring of the woman and the serpent, which represents Satan. And so that battle is right from the beginning. Satan has been trying to destroy the coming of the Messiah from the beginning, and he was just trying to destroy his people. Revelation 12, verse 13 to 17 indicates that just as the woman Israel often experienced torment while preparing for the first coming of Messiah, the church is tormented in preparation for the second coming of Jesus. In verse 3, then we see a great red dragon. This is the second character that is being introduced in this drama. First we have the woman, now we have a red dragon, which in Revelation stands for Satan. That's very clear, because later we'll see Revelation 12 verse 9, the dragon is clearly says it's Satan. Like with the previous character, the woman, John, when he introduces a new character in this drama of the Earth's history, John is first identifying this character, the dragon, in terms of personal description or historical role and activities. Once he has done that, he moves into the description of the player's function and activities that are especially important to the vision here in chapter 12. So first he'll give us a historical background of this character, the dragon, and then he'll move to describe specifically what's important to the vision here of chapter 12. It says that the dragon was color red, which is the color of oppression and bloodshed. And it denotes the oppressive character of Satan against the church. Also, we see that it has 7 heads. On the basis of Revelation 17, 9 to 11, and we'll study that in details when we get there, the 7 heads of the dragon represent kingdoms through which Satan has worked to torment and oppress God's people throughout history. So we'll see that clearly in Revelation chapter 17. Then when we move forward, we see that the dragon has 10 horns. Horns in the Bible, especially in the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation, horns are symbols of political powers. The 10 horns of the sea beast that we'll see in Revelation 13 are the 10 horns of the 4th beast from Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7, where they symbolize the kingdoms which followed the breaking up of the Roman Empire into 10 parts, and these are represented here as well. 7 crowns, the dragon has 7 crowns. These are royal crowns. The Greek word is diadema. These crowns suggest Satan's false claims of full authority and power in opposition to the true King of Kings, which is Jesus, who wears many crowns in Revelation chapter 19, verse 12 to 16. We'll see that when we study Revelation 19. So Satan here wants to usurp Jesus' authority and power, and he's represented with crowns here. The dragon here primarily symbolizes Satan, acting behind the power of pagan Rome, attempting to destroy Christ when he was born, and then attempting subsequently to destroy his followers. The 10 horns of the dragon suggest that Satan's work against the church will continue in significant measure throughout the period following the breakup of the Roman Empire. In verse 4, more description of the dragon. It says he has the tail. Tail symbolizes deception by means of persuasion that Satan has used to mislead others to rebel against God and follow him. And that we'll see in Revelation 12, verse 9. That's very, very clear. Also, the stars. In the Bible, especially in the book of Revelation, stars symbolize angels. The third part of the stars symbolizes the angels that joined Satan in his rebellion against God. He drew them with the tail, with deception by means of persuasion. This seems to describe the rebellion of Satan at the beginning of great controversy that is described in Isaiah chapter 14. And so Satan used this deception by means of persuasion in heaven. That war wasn't really a literal war, was a symbolic war with words and trying to persuade the angels of heaven to follow him and take his side. And it says a third part of the angels actually took his side. Next, John sees the dragon standing before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gives birth to her child, he might devour him. The reference to the continual hostility of the serpent, which is Satan, towards the woman, and the enmity between the serpent's seed and the woman's seed is announced, as I mentioned before, is announced right from the beginning in Genesis 3, verse 15. Satan was there to destroy Jesus through Herod and the Roman Empire when he was born. His efforts continued until the end of Jesus' ministry and continues today. Today, Satan is trying to destroy Jesus in the hearts of those who accept him. So Satan was there when Jesus was about to be born, and trying to destroy through human powers, through human authorities, he was trying to destroy Jesus, and he's trying to destroy Jesus in the hearts of his followers today as well. In verse 5, it says that the child was finally born, and John does not leave his readers in any doubt that this child is anybody else but the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ. He says that he will rule, this male child who was to rule or to shepherd all nations with a rod of iron. The Old Testament church, meaning Israel, gave birth to child Jesus. And he is going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. John alludes here to the royal psalm of 2, verse 7 and 9, where the Davidic king, the Messiah, is the anointed one. This verse also echoes a prophecy from Micah 5, verse 2 and 4. Now, it's very interesting. So, John mentions that the child is born and he will rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And then, without any reference to his life, to the life of Jesus and his ministry and activity, John depicts Christ as being taken, and it says Jesus was caught up to God and to his throne, where he is to rule, where his rule begins in the heavenly places. So he's caught up to his God, to his Father, and to his throne. Now, why is John omitting the ministry of Jesus Christ here on earth? He is just born, and then he's ruling with a rod of iron, and he's cut up. Nothing mentioned about his ministry. This omission of the earthly life of Jesus may be explained on the basis of the fact that in the book of Revelation, John's interest is not in human Jesus, but in the exalted Christ, who is able to rescue his people in the time of their distress. It is after Christ's ascension that the church faces severe wrath from the dragon, from Satan, and persecution. Verse 5 seems to be suggesting the transition between the woman, the Old Testament church, the Israel, and the woman, the New Testament church, which is spiritual Israel. After the Old Testament church brought into existence Jesus, the Messiah, so to speak, gave birth to Messiah, and he's caught up to heaven, then we have the followers of Christ becoming the spiritual Israel. So the woman is the church, the followers of Jesus Christ. After Christ's ascension to heaven, the church comes under severe attack by Satan. The woman, it says, flees into the wilderness, where she is nourished for 1260 days. The wilderness is the place prepared by God for the woman. The scene here is similar to Israel's escape from Pharaoh and the Egyptians when they came out of Egypt and they went to the wilderness, where God cared for Israel and provided them with manna as nourishment for their sustenance. So it's the same experience, the wilderness experience, but the wilderness was the place prepared by God where He'll provide for them. That's the place where they could escape from Pharaoh. The same here symbolically, the wilderness is the place where God's people can escape the persecution during the 1260 days or 1260 years. As a model of Israel's wilderness experience, John portrays God's people as cared for and nourished spiritually by God during the time of the wilderness hardship and severe oppression and that they experience in the world. So what is this period? Once again, I showed you already a few times, and we'll keep showing it to you, because this 1260-day period equals 1260 years based on the year and day principle in prophecy, which we take it from Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4, verse 6, and corresponds to the period of prophesying over the two witnesses from Revelation chapter 11, verse 3 and 6. The parallel between Revelation 12:6 and Revelation 12:14 shows that this period is the same time as time, times, and half a time. This links Revelation 12 to Daniel chapter 7, verse 24 and 25, where we have the time of the little horns activity as time, times, and half a time. And that will become more clear when we talk in our next presentation, Revelation chapter 13. So John here in Revelation 12 points here to the oppression of God's people from the persecuting power of the little horn from Daniel 7 during authoritarian ecclesiastical rule of the Middle Ages. So let's move on to verses 7 to 12 in Revelation chapter 12. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heaven, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. This section here functions as a sort of interlude, interrupting the further description of the dragon's persecution of the woman. It is placed between the account of Christ's ascension to heaven and the woman's escape into the wilderness, and the later description of Satan's attack on the church. So its purpose is to provide some particular information on the activities of the dragon and his hostility against the woman and her descendants. So what is the root cause for this hostility of the dragon, of Satan, against Christ and against his followers? Verse 7, it says there was a war in heaven. Once again, this war must be understood as verbal rather than physical. Christ and Satan are described as being engaged in the battle for the allegiance of the heavenly beings. According to the text, this war takes place after the child has been taken from the earth. So this war takes place after Jesus ascends to heaven, when he goes to heaven. This is not the same war that happened at the beginning of the great controversy that we already talked about in verse 4, and we will see that a little, and I'll explain to you. Now, we have Michael here, and Michael, from Hebrew, Mikael, means who is like God. This name is mentioned 5 times in the Bible. In the book of Daniel, Michael is the commander or the chief priest, of the chief prince. In Daniel 12 verse 1, Michael is the great prince who protects God's people. In Jude verse 9, because it's just one chapter, so in Jude verse 9, he is the archangel, and here in Revelation 12, he is the commander of the heavenly army, Michael. So Michael is an important figure in the Bible. Michael represents here Jesus Christ himself. Michael is the commander of the heavenly army. He is the commander of the heavenly angels. He is the great prince from Daniel. And so, once again, here Michael is represented. It's just another name for Jesus Christ. We see here the devil being cast down. This phrase cast down is the Greek balo, which means cast out or cast down. This word has a judicial, this phrase cast down has a judicial meaning. It is a technical term for excommunication. Now, it's interesting. What's happening here? The question is, when did this take place? This excommunication of Satan from heaven, this judicial excommunication. The evidence strongly suggests that Revelation 12, 7 to 12, describes the event that took place after the cross. The casting down of Satan from heaven suggests his excommunication from heavenly council. It is not his expulsion from heaven when he rebelled against God at the beginning of history of sin, at the beginning of great controversy that is described in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. That's not the same expulsion. Between then and Christ's death on the cross, Satan evidently still had access to heavenly places. We see him attending the assembly of the sons of God before the Lord in heavenly places in Job chapter 1, verse 6 to 12. And accusing Joshua, the high priest, before God in the heavenly courts in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1 to 2. So the Bible seems to suggest that Satan still had access to heaven even after he was expelled from heaven or thrown out from heaven at the beginning of the great controversy. But the situation changed with the death of Christ on the cross, where Satan's defeat was assured. It was at the cross that it became clear to the entire universe the character of God's rule. In the same manner, it was at the cross that the entire universe came to realize Satan's true character. As a result, Satan was forever excommunicated from heavenly places. And since then, there was no longer any place found for him and his angels in heaven. Jesus referred to Satan's expulsion as legal action in John 12, 31 to 33, and he says, now is the judgment of this world. Now the rule of this world will be cast out. The same wording that is used here in Revelation 12, verse 7 to 12. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. This he said, signifying by what death he would die. The word now in this verse referred to death of Jesus Christ on the cross. It is the death of Jesus that marks the casting down of Satan as well as the exaltation of Christ on the heavenly throne. In verse 10, this is a hymn that is sung in heaven announcing God's victory over Satan. The hymn begins with this temporal adverb now. The word refers first to the longed-for time when Satan, the accuser of brethren, of the brothers, is finally expelled from the heavenly places. It says, now, when Jesus died on the cross and he was resurrected and went to heaven, now is the time when the accuser of the brothers is finally expelled from heaven. But second, it refers when the authority passes to Christ, who was enthroned on the heavenly throne at God's right hand. Revelation 12:10 refers to the enthronement of Christ after his death and resurrection and subsequent ascension to the heavenly places, which took place at the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, verse 32 to 36. And remember, we looked at that in details in Revelation chapter 5. When Jesus was ascended to heaven, he took the seven-sealed scroll and he was enthroned on the throne of the universe right next to his Father, on the right hand of the Father, and he began to rule. This evidently didn't... When Jesus was enthroned, Satan was still present in the heavenly court. So evidently, this didn't really go well with Satan, and it did not go without some form of resistance and opposition from Satan. This is why this scene is described as a war in heaven. He didn't like that, and so that war happened, that opposition happened in heaven. In verse 11, it says that the followers of Christ overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. In this lies the secret of the victorious life for the followers of Jesus Christ. Their victory over Satan comes by the virtue of what Christ has accomplished on the cross. The blood of Christ produces the victory in us. Their victory, the victory of the saints, is affirmed further by their loyalty to Christ, which they consider more important than their own lives. In verse 12, while Satan's expulsion from heaven arouses great joy among all heavenly beings, that's why we have that hymn sung by the heavenly beings. It says, "It is woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you." Now, Christ's victory over Satan is only partial. He is defeated in heaven, but he's still allowed to exercise his power here on earth. The earth and the sea here, it says, this woe to the earth is significant because Satan is filled with great anger, knowing that he has little time. It is after, now, when did Satan realize that he has little time? When he was expelled from heaven initially at the time of the great controversy when it began, he didn't really realize that he has still just a short time. When did he realize that? It is after he had been cast out of heaven, excommunicated from heaven, at the time when Jesus was enthroned as the King of the universe, after he went to heaven, after his resurrection and ascension to heaven. At that time, Satan realized that he had just little time. He has just a short time. Something that he did not realize, as I said at the beginning of his rebellion in heaven. This knowledge came after he was defeated at the cross. Satan realized that he has lost the war. The cross has provided strong assurance for his defeat. Satan now pours out his full anger on the followers of Christ, who are faithful and loyal to him. So, we see here Satan is angry because of two things. First, because he was excommunicated from heaven. Second, because Satan's rule over the earth has passed to Christ. That's when he was enthroned on the throne in heaven, as we saw in Revelation chapter 5. The text seems to suggest that the event in Revelation 12:4, the first part, that took place at a different time than the one that we see here in Revelation 12, verse 7 to 9. The first event, Revelation 12, verse 4, describes Satan's expulsion from heaven at the beginning of the great controversy when he managed to deceive a third of the angels, and subsequently they all were expelled from heaven as their dwelling place. They could not dwell, they could not live in heaven any longer. Now, the second event, describes Satan's and his angels' permanent excommunication from heaven after the death of Jesus Christ on the cross and his resurrection, ascension to heaven, and enthronement in heaven. In the first event, Satan is the one who does the actions. If you look at that, he draws with his tail, with his deception, a third of the stars, a third of the angels, and throws them down. This throwing down is described as a consequence of Satan's own actions. Satan is described in the Bible as a fallen angel because he fell as a result of his own evil action, of his pride. So it's not God that really throws him down to earth in the first place. It was a consequence of his own actions. In the second event, Michael is the one who is doing the action, Jesus Christ. Satan and his angels were cast down because they were not strong enough and because they lost the war, so the action is being done upon them. They were expelled, excommunicated. It was as a legal action, excommunication from heaven. The casting down is not a consequence, but an execution of a verdict. There is no more place found for Satan and his angels in heaven anymore. That is the verdict. And that is why they can no longer have access to heaven. And that happened after the cross and after ascension to heaven and enthronement of Jesus Christ. Bible Commentary, Volume 7, page 973 and 974 says this: "The casting down of Satan as an accuser of the brethren in heaven was accomplished by the great work of Christ in giving up his life." That's the cross. Notwithstanding Satan's persistent opposition, the plan of redemption was being carried out. Satan, knowing that the empire he had usurped would in the end be wrested from him, determined to spare no pains to destroy as many as possible of the creatures whom God had created in his image. He hated man because Christ had manifested for him such forgiving love and pity. And he now prepared to practice upon him every species of deception by which he might be lost. He pursued his course with more energy because of his own hopeless condition. This is what Satan did. When he realized that he doesn't have much time, which happened after Jesus was enthroned, when he realized he doesn't have much time, now he's going to go and his wrath he's going to take against God's people to try and destroy, to deceive and destroy as many as possible, because he wants everyone to have that hopeless condition that he has, everyone to participate in that hopeless condition. He wants to destroy God's people. So this is the next portion of Revelation 12. Revelation 12, verse 13 to 17. "Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth," he was cast out permanently, excommunicating, "he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon has spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." So, having failed to overthrow Christ, Satan turns his attention to Christ's followers. We now return to the scene of Revelation 12, verse 6, the description of which is repeated in Revelation 12, verse 13 to 14. So in verse 13, "When the dragon saw that he was cast down to the earth, he persecuted the woman." The opening words of the text here explain why Satan is filled with fury against the church. The main reason for his anger involves his expulsion from heaven after the transference of authority and rule over the earth from him to Christ. He didn't like that. So now, and also because he realized he doesn't have much time, he said, "I'm going to take all my efforts, all my rage and my fury, and I'm going to throw that on Christ's followers." He couldn't overcome Christ. Now he's taking it against his people. In verse 14, when he started persecuting the woman, which is God's church, it says the 2 wings of a great eagle were given to the woman to flee into the desert, into the wilderness. Now, a new detail is added here. This is a reference to Old Testament text describing Pharaoh chasing the people of Israel after they came out of Egypt, where they were fleeing from Egypt. And it says that God carried them on eagle's wings and brought them to himself. That's what it says in Exodus 19, verse 4. Also in Isaiah 40, verse 31, a very, very familiar text, the eagle's wings are associated with the return of Israel from the exile. this talks about God's provision and protection. He'll protect them and He'll provide for them. And once again, the same time period is mentioned that we saw every time. A time, times and half a time. It means a year, 2 years and half a year, which gives us 3.5 years, which gives us 1260 days, which is in prophecy is 1260 years. This is the same period as in Revelation 12 verse 6, the time of persecution of the people of God from 538 AD to 1798 AD. Verse 15, it talks about the mouth. The mouth in Revelation refers to a mighty weapon in the spiritual battle between good and evil. Water, like a flood, comes out of the mouth. The water can mean two things here. First, Satan's effort to destroy the church, by physical force and persecution. In the Old Testament, the nations that persecuted Israel are portrayed as waters or floods sweeping the nations. So the first thing here, the floods, the waters, can mean Satan's efforts to destroy the church by physical force and persecution. Second, the flood-like river also symbolizes Satan's effort to sweep away the church with deceit and false teaching. This may be a reference to Garden of Eden, where deceit came out from the serpent's mouth, from the mouth of Satan. Revelation 16:13-14 talks about the three unclean spirits coming out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophets. Taken together, these two interpretations refer to the two strategies that Satan uses to harm and destroy the people of God. The first strategy is force and persecution. The second is deception or false teachings. And he uses both of those strategies very, very effectively throughout history. In verse 16, the earth, when the dragon spewed out this water, the persecution and this deception, and to kill God's church, it says the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river. It swallowed the water. This imagery is taken from Israel's wilderness experience, when the earth opened its mouth and swallowed Korah, Dathan, and Abiram because of their rebellion against Moses' authority and leadership in Numbers 16, verse 31-33. Just as in the past, God provided protection to His people, so now He provides protection for His church from Satan's flooding waters of persecution and false teaching. God is the one that helps the church. And in Revelation 13, we'll see more about how earth helps the woman during this time. In verse 17, it says, the remaining ones of her offspring. The word remnant comes from Greek word loipos, meaning remaining or the rest. The remnant in Revelation is used 3 times and also refers to God's faithful people. The remnant, the remaining ones, or the remnant, or the remaining ones of the woman's offspring are the followers of Christ, living in the last period of this earth's history. Revelation 17 indicates that this woman, who once was the true church, was the pure church of God, will, during the end time events, will have a very negative role. She will eventually turn from her faithfulness, from being a pure woman, being a pure church, and turn from her faithfulness to God to oppose God and His true people. She will become an apostate woman. That is why God's end-time people in Revelation are referred to not as the woman anymore, because she became apostate and which we'll see in Revelation chapter 17, this woman again. But because of that, the true church is not referred anymore as the woman, but is referred as the remaining ones of the woman's offspring, as the remnant, because the woman is not God's church anymore. So the remnant here in the last days of this earth's history, those who remain faithful to God to the end, those who will not join this apostate woman in the last days, they are referred here, they have two identifying characteristics. The first one, they keep the commandments of God. Notice that we have to keep the commandments of God, not the commandments of man. Also, we need to keep all the commandments, not just a few commandments. Also, we must keep the commandments not legalistically, trying to earn salvation through our obedience to the commandments, but we keep the commandments of God out of love for Him. Love motivates us to keep the commandments. That's what it's expressed in John 14, verse 15. Revelation 13 points out that the obedience to God's commandments will be the focal point in the last and end time conflict, and we'll look at that in the next presentation. So the people of God, the remnant, in the last conflict of this earth's history, will be identified by those who keep all the commandments of God. The second identifying mark of this group is that they have the testimony of Jesus Christ. The Greek word can be translated two different ways here. First, those who have the testimony about Jesus, Jesus becomes the object of Christians' witness. Or second, those who have the testimony of Jesus, meaning this is the testimony that Christ Himself bears through those who have the gift of prophecy, the prophets, and bears through His church. So it's a testimony of Jesus Christ. It's a testimony about Jesus Christ. This is the second characteristic of this remnant group in the last days. They keep the commandments, and they have the prophetic gift among them, and they are the ones that bear witness, and they bear testimony about Jesus and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Revelation 19:10 identifies the testimony of Jesus Christ as the spirit of prophecy. This expression was used in John's day to designate the Holy Spirit speaking through the prophets. So once again, the second characteristic is very clear here, that this remnant group of people, the remnant in the last days, will have the prophetic ministry present among them. The role of the prophets in the Bible was to bear witness to Christ. Revelation shows that at the time of the end, God's faithful people will have the prophetic gift in their midst to guide them through those hard times when Satan will make every effort to deceive and to destroy them. So here we are ending with the presentation tonight on Revelation chapter 12. It is a very important chapter. It sets the foundation. It's an introductory vision to the entire section until the end of the book, until Revelation chapter 22. It presents Jesus as the commander of the heavenly armies, who withstands the dragon, who is Satan and his angels. Satan lost to Jesus a few times. That's why he's very upset. He lost in the beginning of the great controversy, and there was no more dwelling place found for him and his angels anymore in heaven. By his own action, he paid the consequence that he could not dwell anymore in heaven. Then he lost to Jesus at the cross again. When Jesus died on the cross and he was resurrected and he ascended to the heavenly place and he was enthroned, Satan saw that was the end for him, that he saw there is no more time. How would you feel losing to the same adversary time and time again? And so Satan feels enraged. And so now when he saw that he couldn't win against Christ, he takes this rage against the follower of Christ, the woman who was persecuted. Then the woman becomes apostate. And then in the last days, he's going to take that rage and wants to destroy the remnant. But the remnant will be able to stand. Christ will protect his remnant during the last days. And all of this sets the stage for chapter 13 that we'll look in the next presentation. And we will see what the dragon, Satan, is doing to destroy God's people and how God is protecting his people during those last days. Thank you for watching this presentation. We'll see you next time. God bless you.